Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And we're joined today by Paul Cuff, a film historian and one of the foremost experts on Abel Gance, and particularly Abel Gance's Napoleon, and Napoleon in his many forms on screen, and the author of A Revolution for the Screen, Abel Gance's Napoleon. And we've seen the new Napoleon, directed by Ridley Scott. So it's an opportunity to speak to someone who's an expert on one of the great versions of it and see how it compares and that sort of thing. Hello, Paul.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. I was really curious to know your opinion on this version of Napoleon. But actually, maybe you can start by just telling us of your interest in Napoleon in cinema. Really?
Sure. I have to say, Napoleon by Abel Gance, the 1927 film, is a film that found me. I wasn't looking for it. I didn't know it existed. A friend of mine happened to get tickets for the screening in 2004 and took me along. And when I saw it, I thought, where has this been all my life? And it kind of connected to some part of me that was kind of longing for this object, but didn't know it existed in the world. But I should say also that as a child, I was obsessed with Napoleon,
Right.
The historical figure. I collected small plastic figurines of Napoleon's armies and fought battles on a miniature snooker table.
Wow.
When I set it up at home, and I kind of devoured particularly books of uniforms of the period because I loved the uniforms, and I read everything I could on the battles and campaigns and lives. So I was a sort of a Napoleon nut quite young, and then my interest sort of faded away a bit, and cinema came into my life. And so when I saw the Gance film, all my kind of previous interests kind of beautifully coincided with this newfound object of miraculous wonder that is Napoléon vu par Abel Gance, to give it its full title, Abel Gance's Napoleon. But I should also mention the fact that I'd sort of in between my childhood love and seeing Napoleon, I also watched quite a lot of other films about Napoleon or set in the Napoleonic period. So particularly I'm thinking of the Sergei Bondarchuk War and Peace, 4 films made in the mid-late 60s in Soviet Russia. And also the same director's film Waterloo, with Rod Steiger as Napoleon and Christopher Plummer as Wellington. And then more recently, actually, I've ended up watching the Sacha Guitry 1955 film, also called Just Napoleon. And I've seen Antoine de Caunes, who was, as most people in Britain know him as Eurotrash, the host thereof. He's also a film director. He made a film called Monsieur N, which is sort of partially inspired by a novel, the author of which I've forgotten, but essentially it's about Napoleon on St. Helena. I've also seen Ridley Scott's Napoleonic era set film The Duelists, which I think is one of his first features, or one of his breakout, one of his first features.
First, yes.
It is his first. What else? I was trying to think after I'd seen the Ridley Scott one, how many other ones I'd seen, but kind of enough to get a good kind of flavour of this sort of strange subgenre of the historical film, or the historical biopic, or the historical epic, or stuff related to Napoleon. So between all of my various obsessions across my life, I'm reasonably well placed, or possibly spectacularly badly placed, to watch Ridley Scott's film and have some sort of opinion on it.
There's also the Brando version, Désiré, I think,
which I've not seen. I think it's one of the famous ones I've not seen.
Yeah. And also, is it Maria Walenska with Garbo, with Charles Boyer playing Napoleon?
Oh gosh, that's the other one I've not seen.
Yeah,
yes, again, it's strange. The ones I've not seen tend to be the ones which are more about the romantic Napoleon.
Yes,
or it's got melodramas rather than kind of historical epics. I think my kind of crude, childish self likes big things and blowing up and cannons and smoke and spectacle on a huge scale. So those are the kinds of films that attracted me as a child. And I mean, Gance's film is much more than that, but also the spectacle of it. It is the most spectacular in many ways of all the kind of Napoleonic films. Yeah. And again, from the advertising of the Scott one, that seems to be, at least in part, how it is selling itself, amongst other things.
I think we're not going to have too much of a comparison with the Gance film because it's so long since I've seen it. Mike hasn't seen it, and besides, it's just an incomparable work of art, really. So there's almost kind of like, not too much point in drawing a direct comparison throughout the film.
Yes.
But actually, before we start talking about Ridley Scott, I would like you just to tell us about some of the achievements of that extraordinary version, just so we have that
Sure.
loosely in mind.
Well, to start with, perhaps it's worth saying, firstly, the title of the film, as I said, is Napoléon vu par Abel Gance. So it's usually translated as Abel Gance's Napoleon, but actually more literally, I think, and more interestingly, you would translate it as Napoleon seen through Abel Gance.
Mm.
So it is both history, Napoleon, and it is also Abel Gance giving you a kind of subjective vision of Napoleon. And his aim was to show the young Napoleon up until kind of the very kind of first military campaign he got involved with. And the film ends in 1796, so just as he's starting his kind of rise to real fame. And Gance originally wanted to make 6 films spanning the whole of Napoleon's life. He got 2/3 of the way through his first screenplay and spent the money for the entire series, and ended up with a film that was 10 hours long. So it was kind of this unbelievably elaborate and kind of madly grandiose vision, which he never realized. I mean, he made, I was going to say, the other thing I've seen is all the other films that Gance made after Napoleon, which were either remakes and reworkings of the material of the first one, or I mean, all of them are increasingly mad and awful and chaotic. I mean, until 1970, when he made his kind of final reworking, which uses footage from all his previous versions into a kind of very awful, terrible kind of 4-hour concoction at the end of his life when he's reflecting back on his own films. But in the 1920s, he wanted to make the whole span of Napoleon's life, and he would kind of have different actors for each of the films. So it wouldn't just be one actor kind of being made to look old; it would be kind of older actors at each stage. And in the first film, essentially the first episode of 6, which is the only one he ended up making as he in something like the form he wanted to. His vision was to show that Napoleon was the last in a long line of idealist Republicans, the first of whom was Jesus Christ. And those are Gance's words. So that is his mission statement. That is his kind of his thesis that Napoleon should have been the savior of not just France but Europe, and ultimately kind of the ideal, which was the universal republic. So all kings and kingdoms and empires kind of just demolished, and a kind of universal kind of fraternity declared across the entire world. That was Gance's vision for the future. He wanted to involve the League of Nations and actually create this in some sense in reality through cinema, by making kind of people realize that their own kind of nationhood and individuality was kind of meaningless unless we embraced one another across borders, nations, and so forth. And so all of this kind of mentality went into his film about Napoleon, and he filled it with every conceivable form of camera work and editing, and it's got kind of the most ludicrously complex montages, which end up with single frame cutting to kind of hurl you into the past to make you feel it. It has what we, for the sake of ease, call handheld camera work, but of course the cameras being hand cranked were so massive he couldn't hold them by hands. They're chest mounted on a cuirass that the cameramen walked around with these incredibly heavy things. He built steam-powered motors to put cameras on horseback, so you have the perspective of the horses going along. He kind of put a camera on a massive pendulum swing, so it could swoop over his extras to give you the perspective of a metaphor of a wave, and multiple superimpositions, and in the final sequences, split screen. So 3 35mm cameras synced up side by side to give you either a panoramic view of like it's twice as wide as modern widescreen. It's 4:1, the ratio, as opposed to 2.35:1 or whatever. But also superimposition, rapid cutting, and different views across your 3 screens. So it is the single most ambitious film I think ever made, technically, still, and it's still just an astonishing, mind-alteringly wonderful experience to watch, which goodness, I've done the commentary for the DVD of it, but I almost don't want anyone to see the film for the first time at home. You have to see it live, because you simply cannot replicate the experience of seeing it live at home.
Yes.
And I first saw this, and it kind of it altered my conception of what cinema was and could be. And the fact this was made, the best part of 100 years ago is just the maddest thing that cinema is still not up to what Gance thought it should be doing 100 years ago.
Yeah, we should say it's 1927. I don't think we've mentioned the year for anyone who doesn't know. It's very early, particularly for something so ambitious.
It's also had an incredible afterlife, hasn't it? Because, I mean, I remember the... did it have a Francis Ford Coppola, a Coppola score initially? Or was it just produced by Coppola, the release in the 80s? Which is when
the release in the US was, yes, it was kind of sponsored by him, and his father wrote the music.
His father
it had already
wrote the
been
music, right.
it had already been restored by Kevin Brownlow and others in the UK, and then when it went to America, it was cut down and released through Coppola's Zoetrope Studios and then Universal. And there's a whole legal saga which we won't go into around the various different versions of it. But yes, it's and there is currently, we should say, a new Cinémathèque Française restoration, which will be even longer than the longest version previously.
Right.
So it's estimated up to, I'm not sure what the official runtime is yet. It's, my God, it's been in the years and years and years, and every single year for the last nearly 10 years, they said, oh, next year. And they've just said again, oh, next year.
Right.
So supposedly July 24, it's going to be premiered at the Cinémathèque Française.
Fantastic.
I'll believe it when it happens, because they've said this about 6 times already. But it's going to be astonishing, whatever it is. So yes, its afterlife keeps going. It's a film that, even when they found 6.5 hours of it, originally it was nearly 10 hours. The version Gance first showed. Well, he showed a 4-hour version, which was a kind of, not quite a rough cut, but here's like a 4-hour trailer for the film that I want. And then he showed the kind of the unadulterated 10-hour version. And then, yes, anyone interested should read Kevin Brownlow's history of the film, because it's an unbelievably complex, ludicrous saga. I mean, the film itself has sort of become synonymous with a cinematic ambition, which is itself Napoleonic in its kind of hubris and scope. So yes, it is an extraordinary cultural artifact.
So that said, now, what did you think of this Ridley Scott version?
You said you're uniquely badly placed to appreciate it.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Because, well, I mean, I don't think you can make a film called Napoleon, just Napoleon, without inevitably kind of making yourself comparable or kind of complicit with the other versions of his life. I don't think you can make a film about it and not expect to be compared to previous versions of it. And to start with the positive, I thought the uniforms of the soldiers were wonderful, and the research done into making sure they were wearing the right kinds of hats for the different eras of battle was marvelous. One of the problems with the Bondarchuk from the 60s is they're wearing shakos in 1805 when they had the bicorns in 1805, as everyone should know. But this film, they wear the right hats, and the uniforms are lovely, and but I wished a scintilla of the effort put into the research for those uniforms had been put into the script and the direction and the performances, because I thought it was terrible. I had such a bad time. I thought that it was one of those scripts where you thought that like every single line was like a placeholder for the line that they put in when they worked out what they wanted the line to be, and every single bit of performance was like, okay, we'll just do this one. We'll just do a run through. Yeah, we'll just do a run through. Yeah, you play it how you want, and we'll work on it. But no one had ever come back and worked on it, and no one had ever come back and put like the actual lines back in.
You're flabbergasted.
Yes.
Well, we had about an hour in, maybe. We kind of turned to each other. I said to you, "What do you think of it so far?" And you said, "Jose, this is." You felt like transitions were happening quickly. Like the falling into love with Josephine happened very quickly. We didn't really sit. And I suggested it felt like everything was happening in, as you said, kind of in placeholders. Like this is the symbolic version of just getting through his life very quickly.
I mean, so my overall view actually is that I didn't look at my watch once, which in a film that is 2 hours and 40 minutes long is its own kind of accomplishment. So I don't want to lose sight of that, because it's too easy to talk about all the problems that the film has, and in some things we agree. right? Like I think either there's a problem with the script, or this thing that I was talking about, that transitions, that you really don't see the process of Napoleon becoming Napoleon. You don't see the process of this unfolding relationship with Josephine. I actually was very unclear about the initial attraction, and how one thing led to another. If that's the part of the narrative that's taken on, and it is, it should have been denser. We should have had more information on it, and so on. So I agree with that. But there is something about a film this length where you don't look at your watch once that I think is, I don't want to dismiss it. I've seen actually so many reviews now that are so dismissive of the film, and it puzzles me in a way, because I do think, I remember Victor Perkins saying, the worst thing you can do is think that you're smarter than the film. The film is always, the film is always smarter than you. Yeah, even dumb films, because of just the collective aspect of who's involved in it. So, just because you can't see some things doesn't mean they're not there, right? So this is Ridley Scott, after all. He's made an entertaining film. Yeah. So then now, why is it arguably, we'll see what you think, Mike, but in my view, merely an entertaining film? Or did you not find it were you just too annoyed with it to find it even entertaining?
Well, no, I mean, I have to agree. I didn't look at my watch once either, and I have to say, I mean, I was quite on one on a very basic level. I was perfectly happy to sit there for 2 hours and 40. I didn't feel fidgety. I just, it kept moving. But at the same time, inside my skull, my mind was just started rotating around, doing a lot of the work that the film should have been doing for me. And kind of filling in the gaps and trying to work out also. It is bad history, but I don't think that's a problem with any film. I don't mind bizarre accents. I don't mind any. I mean, all of that is kind of irrelevant for the film. I don't think any of that is important. But if you're going to change it, you should be doing it for a definite purpose, to make it dramatically, for the sake of the film, work better in some way, I think. And I don't think it was doing that.
I don't know if we could just spend a moment on that, Paul. And sorry, Mike, we'll get back to you, but
happy to let this. I'm not a Napoleon expert by any means. Can't continue.
One of the things that has been really annoying was that kind of supercilious, superior kind of downgrading of the film. Oh, this didn't happen, and this didn't happen, and there was nowhere near the pyramids. And you do think, who cares? I mean, when you talk about von Sternberg's The Scarlet Empress, is the first thing that comes to your mind that it wasn't historically accurate? No, it's absurd as an argument, right? Like, I think it really is. You're not making a documentary about it. It is a fiction film. And we're used to the conventions of a fiction film. We expect some accuracy, right? Like, you want to see a period kind of evoked. But actually, the audience is not a historian, and it's not going to be judging you on, whether the right uniforms were used. Though obviously there will be a small proportion who know those uniforms, who will. But most of us don't know, don't care, right? So, the historicist argument, I think, is a truly banal one, which I'm shocked, that 100 years after one thought this argument had been responded to, that it still periodically crops up, as it does in this instance, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I would argue that it's historically accurate enough not to take you out of the narrative that it sets up for itself, right? So now, Mike, your response.
Well, on the press tour, just on that point of historicity, on the press tour, which has been ridiculously entertaining, Ridley Scott has been batting away these accusations of historical inaccuracy by saying, when historians say to me, this is inaccurate, I go, were you there? Well, then fuck off. And before the film began, I was kind of thinking, how can the film possibly be as entertaining as everything Ridley Scott's been saying in promoting the film? And he also talked about, he was accused particularly of ahistoricity, with the scene where Napoleon fires cannons upon the pyramids in Egypt that you allude to. And he said, quite simply, this is a way of very quickly telling the audience that he took Egypt, which
which
to some
worked for
extent.
me.
Well, it goes to that point that we were both sort of suggesting of him telling the story with kind of economy and symbolism to suggest things that he's not fully fleshing out, which is not necessarily that point necessarily needs to be fleshed out all that much. It was more important, I think, in the case of falling for Josephine and so on. When it comes to my overall experience in the cinema, I was a bit fidgety. I did check my watch. I didn't find the film that compelling. And I could tell that it wasn't just like my mood, because when it got to the battle scene, I can't remember which battle it was, but it's the one where they end up sinking everybody in the ice, which I understand is
Austerlitz.
which I understand itself is an anachronism, I think. Not an anachronism. What's the word? Apocryphal, if that's right.
Well, it's during the retreat, the Austro-Russian army did have to navigate frozen rivers, and there was a lot of difficulty extricating themselves from it.
Right.
So it is factually based, even if it is not as it.
But the idea of him kind of trapping them, luring them into that, is that the? That's what I don't know. I mean,
the Austerlitz in the film has very, very little to do with the real Austerlitz. Right. It was. The Austerlitz is famous for the sunlight of Austerlitz because it was a foggy battlefield which helped Napoleon mask his troop positions and kid the Russians into making a wrong move, and then he therefore kind of broke their centre and scattered their forces. And as he was doing so, the fog lifted and the sun rose over the mountains in the background, and everyone, the whole army, remembered this kind of absolutely symbolic vision. It's the sunlight of Austerlitz. That is what it's famous for, much more than anything else. So
So the sunlight is not what's shown in the film, but the elements of the fog and making them the army performing a wrong move and being taken advantage of.
Yes,
that is incorporated into that scene. But what I could tell, that it wasn't just my mood, is that during that scene I was completely engaged. The build up to that battle, seeing everyone kind of move into position. Where's everything going to go? I was hooked, and the film has moments like that. I was pretty much hooked throughout Waterloo as well. I think those really, really worked for me, which is why pretty much everything else not working for me, I think, speaks to there's just something not working in the film. I think there is a lack on. I kind of, because I don't, I know the figure of Napoleon, but I never really studied him by any means. I don't know all that much about him, and it's not like I went into the film expecting to learn, especially given all that context from the press interviews about this is all we just made this up.
But I think it's important because for me the central failure of the film is that you don't know who Napoleon is.
This is it. Yes. I mean, I don't even know essentially what his plans are, what his intentions are. He talks about wanting peace, and there's a kind of irony in the way that peace is coming through endless war. But is it that he wants to take over the world? What does he actually want? I get very little idea of that through the film.
Well, I think it's even more complicated than that because partly because they cast Joaquin Phoenix, who must be 50 now. You don't get a sense of the young Napoleon. How did a young Corsican minor nobleman become Napoleon, right? Yeah, and then what were his wishes and desires when I don't get a sense of that. Did you, Paul?
No, I think that's none of the history matters at all if you have a central thesis of your own to propel the narrative, to propel the script, the story, everything. And that's what this film didn't have. So I mean, it keeps moving along, but at the same time, you don't know what it is that's propelling you forward, other than the fact that time must pass, and we've got to cover this whole lifespan. And I need to get rid of my cookies so I can therefore get my second free New Yorker article of the month or whatever, so I can go back and reread an article, which means that there was a piece essentially. I think it was kind of. About Ridley Scott and Joaquin Phoenix, kind of like 48 hours before things began. Joaquin Phoenix said, "I don't know who this character is. Can we please meet and go through it again?" And that's what the script feels like. It went into production without anyone quite knowing what your thesis of the film was. What is the point of the film? What is your view on Napoleon? I mean, you can make a very simple Napoleon was a bad man. He had, millions of people died as a result of his actions quite easily. Or you can have the Gancian view where you have, well, here is the kind of the tragic hero who was born to kind of have a profound effect on human history, but was kind of, ended up in a cycle of wars and became his own kind of worst enemy. But this film didn't have either. And I was particularly, when the text appears at the end with a kind of body count for the wars, I'm thinking, well, what are you saying? Are we supposed to think, how is this relating to what we have just seen? Is this a kind of and now my point is he was a bad man? Or I don't understand. The film does not give you enough information, and particularly Phoenix's performance does not give you enough information to go on as to how we're supposed to take Napoleon. He is not a coherent, consistent character either to like or dislike. And
it's an odd performance, because at the very beginning, the very first time we see him in the film, where he turns his head, you think, oh my God, that's my idea of Napoleon anyway, right? But he's such an odd and very interesting and sometimes compelling actor. But he's always a bit distant. I never felt in this film that you actually got into his head at all, right? Which is a real problem, because, Napoleon is so iconic that, a large part of a European audience will know about him, will know the loose outlines of the life, will know the hat and the face. Yes. What you want to know is the person, what actually is going on inside that head. And actually, I think Phoenix's performance never lets you in.
And I think the other problem, I mean, again, I would be absolutely fine with a film which gave you a complete distance between you and Napoleon. If the point of Napoleon was he was in some way inhuman, that in itself is a kind of a thesis which you could make something of.
Sure.
I mean, part of Gance's film is Napoleon's character's journey is from, someone who falls in love, who has lots of feelings, who eventually becomes more and more detached from human life because he becomes a kind of symbol of himself. He becomes the hat, the silhouette. He goes from being, and this is a distinction lots of writers and historians have made, since the 19th century onwards, between Bonaparte, the young man, and Napoleon, the emperor, the man who betrayed the principles of Bonaparte. So you can have that journey to this kind of person who is somehow detached from his kind of real human self. So again, a film which was kind of just showing you that kind of distant, kind of inhuman Napoleon would be interesting. But this film isn't doing that either. It's giving you lots of kind of scenes of his intimate life, and yet you don't get any sense of intimacy. And it's it was a really awkward performance. There were lots of scenes which it was kind of going for humor, which I found quite awkward. I mean, there were I did laugh at a couple of points. I love the bit where he says, "Destiny has brought me this lamb chop."
Yes.
I thought that, and I wish there'd been kind of more scenes where the comedy kind of like the jokes landed. But so often it was just a really awkward, like it was searching for a way into the character, literally on screen.
Yes.
You didn't go into the film already with a kind of a character fully formed, and at the end of the film, he quite literally just topples out of frame, and that's it. And you still don't know him. You still don't have a view on him. You still don't know what the film's view on him is.
Yes.
And that's a really dissatisfying way to leave a film.
What did you make of Josephine?
It's Vanessa Kirby, isn't it? And this, because it was going to be Jodie Comer in the original casting, and then she dropped out for whatever reason. And again, she did her best with the script, but I found her performance quite awkward as well, particularly the bit where they were the divorce ceremony, where she was sort of laughing at the line she was being asked to read, and it looked. The whole scene was so awkward, but not in a deliberately awkward way. It was just a kind of, right, this is my first take of the scene. I'll do some things and we'll go from there. But that was it. I mean, I don't want to bring up history, but also my issue with Joaquin Phoenix being, I think he's 49, 50, and him being not really that much different physically apart from his haircut and clothing across the film. And of course, he was several years younger than Josephine in history, but he's a 50-year-old man throughout this film, and that the dynamics of the relationship don't quite work because the film does obey some of the laws, in Napoleon being a kind of gauche outsider and she being a kind of well-to-do socialite who's had numerous previous sexual and romantic relationships, including a marriage and children. But he is an older man on screen, and it's the film never quite negotiates that adequately enough, or it doesn't either ignore it well enough or deal with it well enough. It just sort of, again, it doesn't have a handle on what it's giving us, and it was just, and I get the feeling, kind of, aside from the kind of battle sequences, that was supposed to be our kind of our through line through the film, was their relationship.
Absolutely.
And it was a real problem that it never quite gelled into okay, is this meant to be a real loving relationship that is kind of sullied by his ambitions, or is it not meant to be? Is it a kind of cynical arranged marriage, as it were, for the sake of her, keeping her place in society, and kind of him using her connections to get promotion and so forth, which is absolutely how the relationship is used in other versions of his life in cinema.
There's a line where she says, because he kind of humiliates her and says something like, without me, you're nothing. And then she turns the tables on him and says, without me, you're nothing. And I think that becomes the leitmotif of the film, that actually, as soon as a divorce happens, his career and his status and so on unravels, right? So I think that the film does follow that line of, without me, you're nothing. But actually, we're never shown, why is he nothing without? What does she do for him that makes him, win battles or, win thrones? I mean, that aspect.
The implication I took from that scene is, essentially, there was a kind of transgression to it of the most important figure, sort of this thug to some, violent, winning battles and so on, but he's nothing without this woman. But what you say about her connection socially and that sort of thing is not an impression I got at all from the film. That if that's what she means by that, in some sense, that's not what I got. What I took from that was it's the romantic thing, is that I can make you weak.
You know what I found most what took me out of the film the most upon the introduction of Josephine, and this is maybe to contradict myself earlier about historical accuracy, was her hairdo. Right, I couldn't place that hairdo because it looked like she'd been sent to the guillotine or something. Right, like it was a very short haircut, and I didn't know whether it was meant to evoke that or that she'd been in prison. Or
again, this is a perfect example of the people who do the costumes doing far more research than the film then uses or explains. The reason is they're at a survivor's ball. And the survivor's ball, you dressed as if you were on your way to the guillotine because you were celebrating the fact that you didn't go to the guillotine. So you had your hair cut short because that was the way they made sure the blade could get through the neck. You got all this elaborate hair out the way. Right. They wore kind of very thin red ribbon around their necks to symbolize the red slice of the head. And all the people doing the costumes have done their bloody research, and they know what all this means, so they dress everyone specifically, but neither the script nor the direction either explains it to us to say, hey guys, this is what this means.
Well, the script contradicts it, because the film begins with Marie Antoinette, and she's not with all her hair.
Yes.
So
yes. And again, I mean, the opening scene also reminded me of the Napoleonic film that Joaquin Phoenix is in that's better than this by a long way, which is Quills. Which is Philip Kaufman. It's from 2000. It has Jeffrey Rush and Kate Winslet. And it's a marvellous film, and it's about the Marquis de Sade. And so the first images of the film are kind of a woman's head of hair being brushed back with these kind of leather gloves, and she's kind of sighing, and it's this kind of close-up, and you think she's kind of being, having a marvellous time off camera. And then it's pulled back, and you realise her head's being put in a guillotine. And then you watch it being cut off, and then you cut to de Sade watching from the window. And it's this perfect, that's how to use a guillotine sequence in a kind of an unusual way and make it kind of really disturbing and erotic, and kind of, it's marvellous. And in that film, Joaquin Phoenix plays the priest in charge of the asylum, who then falls in love with Kate Winslet, but she's killed, and then he kind of essentially has sex with her dead body. It's a fictional film about de Sade's demise, told in a manner akin to de Sade telling it. The film is a kind of de Sadean take on de Sade. It's really wonderful. Fantastic screen death of de Sade. He chokes to death on a crucifix. It's wonderful, wonderful. I was thinking of that again. It's like how to use kind of a limited budget in a Napoleonic setting. It does have Napoleon is in that film. He's played by Ron Cook, and the loads of lovely, marvelous jokes of him sat on a throne with his legs kind of playing in the air because he's not tall enough for his legs to reach the ground. And there's like he's on Napoleon in that film is on screen for 10 minutes, but you have an absolutely clear idea of who he is, what he stands for, visual jokes, iconography, everything. If jobs are good in 10 minutes, perfect. And yet the Scott film is 2 hours 40, and you'd never have that, even as a kind of a joke on his iconography, working consistently.
I did think that one of the successes for me in the film was the way that it looks. I don't know if you agree, but actually I thought it was one of the best looking films that I've seen recently. And you can see that Scott and his cinematographer have a painterly eye. And I was thinking, just a random thought, that it's so interesting because he does have like a painterly eye, and he's reputed to do sketches, of everything, of every shot and so on. And yet, in a weird way, it's not a cinematic eye. Yeah, so do you know what I mean? That, he kind of films things in an interesting way, but it's always interesting kind of within the shot. It's not a kind of necessarily an inventive way of filming it. It's just, a kind of a painterly way of filming it. I don't know if you have any views.
It was very pretty and very good. I mean, I should say also that The Duelists, his first Napoleonic film, that is absolutely gorgeous to look at. I mean, it's a much smaller budget, but absolutely impeccably costumed. And again, it's just two characters having duels across the Napoleonic period privately. So you don't have to have any battle scenes at all. So you can spend lots of money just getting like two sets of costumes for two characters right across the film. And it's beautiful, just the kind of countryside, the settings, everything was fabulous. I didn't think this film looked as good as that in terms of landscapes and things. I thought I should also say, I'm from the countryside, and so I can recognize seasons and times and places. I'm very sensitive to that on screen, and it bothers the hell out of me when you say, here is June 1815, and the trees don't have any leaves on, and it's clearly not fucking June on screen. And when you put a title on screen telling me it's June, and it's clearly not June on screen, that's not history as such. That's literally just scene setting, that's kind of location, that's landscape, etc. So I mean, I didn't have a problem with the way the film looked, but my memory of The Duelists is it was a much better looking film and had a much clearer sense of actually moving through the seasons in the way that this film felt. It was cutting corners a lot. I feel like a lot of it was filmed either in early spring or end of year, and they kind of had to cover 25 years of narrative across multiple seasons, and they did it over quite a short stretch of time, filming quite quickly.
Sure.
Which is fantastic economical filmmaking. Bravo, well done. But I feel like it shows in places.
I did think it was the film that really showed its budget. So it's reputed to be between 130 and 200 million. And I was thinking, for me, how wonderful it was, to see a film where it did look like it had hundreds of extras, if not thousands.
Yes.
Rather than having CGI. And I felt it did make a difference in terms of how everything moved and felt to watch. And I did think it was very beautifully lit. Actually, there were moments like the coronation scene, which is it a David painting? It's a famous painting, right? And I thought it evoked kind of like the richness of the oils and the colors, and you recognize the composition. There was something kind of very enthralling about it, actually, for me.
The film is certainly making use of CGI though in those scenes. Though, I mean,
I'm not doubting.
Absolutely, they'll have extras, and then CGI will give you 1,000, 2,000.
But it doesn't feel like little cartoons. It feels like people. No, so they must have used a high degree of real people.
And I mean, one thing. I mean, I should say at the outset, I absolutely love the Sergei Bondarchuk films from the 60s, and Waterloo was 1970, 71. For the War and Peace films, he had the entire Soviet Union working at his disposal to produce uniforms. So he had 14 museums, I think it is, churning out, giving him real artifacts. He had between 12 and 13,000 extras, and they're all on screen. and you can tell. I mean, he's got kind of cameras on wires going over these like miles and miles of battlefields, carefully recreated with all the redoubts and things for the Battle of Borodino, and he just lets the camera swoop over these literally thousands and thousands of fully uniformed people and guns and horses, and it's just astonishing. And Waterloo had, I think, 10,000 extras. Again, Dino De Laurentiis arranged things, wink, wink, with the Soviet army, so they would lend a helping hand. So it's 10,000 extras plus lots of mannequins as well. And the one thing that's really bothered me with some, particularly with Waterloo, just because it's Waterloo and just because there's a film called Waterloo, it's it's one of the most famous battles in human history, and there's so much iconography of the battle in paintings, panoramas. There's like 200 years worth of iconography around the battle. And for Bondarchuk's film, he makes sure that every single shot of his film is filled with people, like real, actual people, like terrifying amounts of smoke and explosive, and horses visibly being like killed in stunts on camera. It's a overwhelmingly brilliant kind of logistical work of choreography. And so I was much less impressed with a few hundred people in a muddy field fighting it out, and the fact that in the background of all the shots, there's empty fields, empty space, empty space, empty space. This was the battlefield was very small, and it was I think like 70,000 people versus 70,000, and then 50,000 more Prussians arrived. Yet this was literally, you could not move for people. The casualty rates were appalling. So I was much less impressed with the battle on that basis. And I know it's ultimately unfair to judge it by another film standard, but I have seen this before.
I know what you mean, though. It didn't look all that big, Waterloo, in this.
Yes, and it's particularly because at the end credits he says, like 30,000 people died in one day. Well, I sure as hell didn't see 30,000 people, or even 300 people on screen. What battles are you describing? You've not given us these titanic struggles. And so its point about death rates and casualties and all the rest of it, we just haven't seen that. I mean, at the end of Waterloo, you get these marvelous kind of this kind of dark battlefield, and essentially all of the extras now reappear as corpses, and he kind of pans and tracks them, and you see that, my God, it's just the camera keeps pulling back, and it's just so many bodies, and you think, okay, that is the aftermath. With this, it's just some text 20 minutes later.
I'll say so two things. I mean, I think first of all, you're not just comparing films, you're comparing like almost two different eras of a cinematic apparatus, right? Like,
True.
So I think, clearly in comparison to those, I grant you're right. I mean, I was talking more in comparison, to the kinds of films that you see nowadays. I did feel the impact of the extras, in the film. And I also liked the battle scenes, actually. I thought they were, so again, I don't know if they're accurate or, all of the dimensions that you're talking about.
No, they're not accurate.
No.
I'll just put that in there. They're not accurate.
So they're not accurate, and they are missing all the dimensions that you talked of in the, how do you pronounce his name, the Russian director?
Bondarchuk. I don't know if that's how you're supposed to pronounce it, but it is spelled Bondarchuk.
Yeah. Those dimensions that you're describing are definitely not in this film. Yet, I did think that it moved well, and I did find it exciting.
There is a brutality to some of it that I really enjoy, which is quite surprising to see as well. Actually, it's just in the number of heads that came off in this film, but and it's not just Marie Antoinette at the start of in the guillotine, but it's like. I think it was in Waterloo, a cannonball takes someone's head off in like the lower left of frame in a scene which has hundreds of people, and I noticed it, and there's a flash of red blood. And you go, wow, that just happened in the corner of the screen. Like, it's some real, at the start, when Napoleon rides into battle and his horse gets blown apart,
Yeah, I thought that was great.
Yeah, and a real surprise, because you don't see that so much with animals. Kind of brutality towards humans is one thing. You tend to see it relatively little with animals on screen, and so that was quite a shock and a kind of introduction to some of the things we would be shown. And also in Waterloo, I thought was interesting. There's a particular thing with the British, the way the British are portrayed.
I love Rupert Everett.
I will second that. He knew exactly what sort of script this was, and he gave that beforehand.
and it's very much a kind of he stood there behind his troops, sending them in, and then we'll be home in time for tea, sort of thing. And there's a reservation. I mean, the British are the only ones drumming during, and the one guy gets taken out by a cannonball, and the other drummer is still stood there, not doing anything. So that's his job. But then you get shots of, and it's only a few shots, but it's really down and dirty, just people on the ground mashing each other's faces in, like it's a real scrap, right? And there's a big difference there between the kind of the honourable fighting and the reservation and the decorum, and you've got a sniper with Napoleon in his sights, and he says, "Don't shoot him. We don't do that." And then on the ground, you've got people just beating each other's faces in, trying not to die.
Yes, that line is in Waterloo, the film Waterloo. But it's Christopher Plummer has his own marvelously kind of very cold, distant, polite performance. I mean, again, no one likes Waterloo, but I would defend it on so many levels. It's not a great film, and it has lots of rough edges and absurdities, but it is quite marvelous. And I do love Plummer's performance in that. There's lots of that film has it has more time to devote to kind of Wellington and Napoleon as contrasting kind of characters, and who, of course, again, well, famously, they never met. They met on the battlefield one time, and it kind of ended Napoleon's career. They didn't, have tea on a boat afterwards. And Plumbers is a marvelously kind of cool, cold character, but he also has compassion at the end. The Waterloo quotes a lot of kind of historical lines from the characters, and it's even if it does take lots of liberties, but at the battlefield at the end, Wellington is there, just kind of walking slowly with his horse through these just fields of dead and mud, and it's a famous line: "Next to a battle lost, the saddest thing is a battle won." And he's just looking at it. You get that kind of moment, which again you don't in the Scott film. It tries to do all of that just in a kind of, oh yes, and here's some text: 28,000 people dead. Okay, it's well done, economic filmmaking again, but it doesn't make enough of it to make more of either the character of Wellington or the aftermath of the battle.
Did it say 28,000 in one day? I thought it said 49,000 in one day for Waterloo. Just a technical point, but that's all.
It was a lot.
I didn't get the brackets one day thing either, because all the other battles were most of the other battles were one day, apart from the Russian campaign as a campaign as a whole. But
anyway. What I took from that text at the end is you were saying what are you supposed to get from it? The 3 million dead. It comes across as a kind of surprise, I suppose, because you have seen wars and things, but you don't get that feeling of the scale of the death that he left in his wake and kind of what he produced. And it's really a sense of importance. This man was important. This is what he left. And then in the context of everything else, you're like, well, why is this the first time I'm feeling this? Surely the whole film should have been getting me to feel this.
So I think the film, to me, and it's a question for you. Is this a very British take on Napoleon?
I was going to ask that.
Because I thought, he affected all of Europe. I mean, he took over Spain, right, Napoleon?
Which doesn't get a mention.
Doesn't get a mention. But, they're very mixed. To a lot of people in Europe still to this day, Napoleon is a hero, right? He's not just like this person who killed 3 million people the way that the film would have it. So, and I thought it was also weird because, kind of, in Europe, I think, Napoleon is a live figure, whereas actually its main market, which I imagine to be America, obviously there was the French-Canadian versus English kind of war in Canada, in what is now Canada. But aside from that, it didn't ripple very much, did it? So I can't say what an American audience's stake in this story is.
No. I think the only stake historically is the fact that Napoleon sold Louisiana and what is all like the whole of the mid-south of America to America, which had big repercussions, but was ultimately that was done through lawyers. Right. It was paperwork. It wasn't anything more than that. But yes, the trouble is I don't know what opinion this film has about Napoleon in order to answer that question, to see if it's a very British view of it. I would say I feel like Rupert Everett's performance is a wonderfully unsympathetic version of who the British are, and you get the ambassador earlier in the film, who's also kind of, he has no manners, and it's a kind of all the the very few British kind of commanders or kind of people you see of a higher rank are just sort of snooty caricatures. So I don't feel the film has any particular sympathy with Britain either way.
It felt to me like self-deprecating humour, that stuff. I laughed at it. I recognised it as the joke about what we're like.
But the joke about what the upper class are like,
yeah,
which I think is also different. So I think there is a kind of the upper class, the king, the ambassador, and so on, are captured in a very affectionate way, in a way that the joke does land, or the character works. It worked with our audience anyway. But I'm thinking more just about the point of view on the character and the life. Yeah, which to me, that ending makes it seem, well, that's kind of a very particular perspective on it.
Yes, that was the impression I got from the ending, but I couldn't sort of reconcile that with what I've been watching for 2 hours 40. I mean, in the sense that it is. I mean, I wouldn't say it was a sympathetic portrait of Napoleon. I mean, it's certainly not a kind of very kind of complex one. The politics of what's going on is very kind of sketchily kind of filled in. It gives you enough to kind of give a sort of sense of why he kind of kept on fighting, but not much more than that. I mean, all other versions that I can think of do much more kind of legwork to give you much more of a grounding in a sense of what was going on and why he might be making these decisions, for good or ultimately, for catastrophic ill for everyone essentially. But I would sort of say it is. I mean, it's certainly not a French perspective on Napoleon. It probably is ultimately a British one in the sense that it would much rather kind of tidy him away as a kind of chaotic autocrat with kind of who was a grubby little figure who did some pulled off miraculous feats of strength and arms and all the rest of it. But again, I find it very difficult to try and work out what this film's view of Napoleon is. I mean, it's simplistic, which is a kind of the British viewpoint of Napoleon. It is a very warped view of, one, who beat him, two, how much involvement the British had in it, and three, what he was trying to do, or how his actions in Europe have their context in the place of Britain's actions. Say, fine, Napoleon, destroyed borders in Europe. How terrible he went to Egypt and conquered Egypt. And well, who invaded Egypt afterwards? The British. Who then invaded India? The British. Who conquered large parts of North America? The British. Who kept on slavery 30 years after this point? The British. Who had an entire empire governed at gunpoint? The British. Apparently, we don't look at that and say, okay, in that context, how do we view Napoleon? In the same way, the Russians who, in the decades before Napoleon came to power, they made their border something like kind of 500 miles further west than it was. They occupied the whole of Eastern Europe. But Catherine the Great and her successors are not known as disgusting megalomaniacs who destroyed lives and everything. But that happened. Austria kind of conquered the whole of Italy and ruled it for decades, but apparently that isn't megalomania. Prussia expanded massively, but apparently that isn't megalomania. But no, Napoleon is megalomania. How dare he do these things? All of this is interesting, and the debate still goes on about all these things, but the film has no interest or time or, frankly, ability to deal with any of these issues. It can't, it doesn't, it has no interest. It's a debate that happens for historians. It's not in the film.
It has no interest in legacy either, I think. It implies its importance with that 3 million people dead, and here's a list of battles. But that's immediate. In these years, in these decades, 3 million people died thanks to him. There's nothing about, and the world went on to change in very whatever, which you might expect from another film, would have another little page of text at the end saying, here's the legacy. It's all immediate. This is what happened right now.
Yes. Part of the reason why I asked that question is I remember having this conversation with Ginette Van Sandeau, saying something, these British, imagine naming a train station, Waterloo. Think of all, the French people who must visit, and the first thing you see is like, a reminder of your failures. And she says, oh, well, I don't mind that much. After all, we have the Gare d'Austerlitz. Yeah, so that's what kind of made me think about, this perspective. And also, I was having a quick glance through Wiki before talking to you. and ostensibly the response in France has been atrocious to the film. So if it's been mixed in Britain, it's been atrocious in France, right? And I did wonder if, what that had to do with, how each culture continues to view the figure of Napoleon.
Another comment from Ridley Scott talking about the frosty French receptions of the film. He said, "The French don't even like themselves." Which is, I think, maybe quite a British thing to say.
Yes. So, Paul, do you have any view on the French reception?
Again, I think the French opinion of Napoleon is very interesting. He has always been a very divisive and ambiguous figure. I mean, he's a massive presence. He's shaped so much of the French legal system, the borders of France, the way Paris look. His imprint is absolutely everywhere.
The Napoleonic Code, my God.
Yes, I mean, which still influences law across the world in large parts. People adopted it even far beyond anywhere that he went. But he's never been quite a hero, like kind of embraced as a hero. He's very awkward. I mean, in parts, there's the whole religious aspect that historically France is very kind of Catholic, and the right wing has been kind of a bastion of Catholicism. So the right wing has never embraced Napoleon, because what he did to the Pope, essentially, he kidnapped him and kind of forced him to do what he wanted, and trampled over various laws. I mean, he did relax religious laws and everything. He also de-ghettoized the Jews across Europe. So for many, he was kind of a liberator. But the right wing in France have never liked him. Their icon is still Joan of Arc. That is their go-to kind of icon of French history, not Napoleon. But again, Napoleon's legacy is he did good things, he did bad things, and there is no kind of clear, consistent view on him. But I think there is a recognition, broadly speaking, that he is a complex and interesting figure. And this is not a complex and interesting version of him, and I think that is the problem. Not so much the particular viewpoint is the fact that it doesn't really have any kind of meaningful thing to say about him, and that, I think, is the issue. That however you take him, he is more interesting than this film presents him. That is the issue.
That I agree with. And just out of curiosity, how do you rate Ridley Scott? Do you rate him at all? And
what I'm about to say, I don't mean this. I have no interest in him. I have nothing against him. I was trying to think of what sort of films within, I don't know, the last 20 years of his that I've seen are. And actually, I've not seen his recent one. I forget the name. It's set in kind of 14th century France. Duel. That's the one. I'd not seen that one. I mean,
I love The Counselor. Kind of Alien, Blade Runner, Thelma and Louise. He does have a whole run of kind of at least interesting films.
Yes, the trouble is that the historical ones that I tend to think of, one are Gladiator, which is, if you're going to do history, and a kind of Gladiator is an exceedingly well-tooled, well-made film, and it does everything that it needs to, and it's in its own way, I think, an excellent kind of self-contained, really good, entertaining film. I really didn't like Kingdom of Heaven.
No, I didn't either.
Which again was filled with kind of lots of beautiful images, but had a kind of a kind of like an anti-personality in the form of Orlando Bloom, as this sort of sucking vortex of nothingness at the heart of the film, just like leeching meaning and charisma. It's just, my God, how can you base a film around that performance? God. But again, it's sort of history. That is a much better historical film, I think, in terms of world building than this Napoleon film. And in Gladiator also is kind of, I think it's not a great, profound masterpiece. I don't think it has anything really to say, but I think it's exceptionally well put together.
Gladiator went through
which
my
is
mind.
Sort of what I was.
Sorry,
I was sort of expecting that with Napoleon, and it wasn't. Sorry,
no. Sorry. Gladiator was going through my mind while I was watching this, thinking of the big personalities, and I mean that film they repeat so often. Win the crowd, shows of the crowd, and I wish there was some winning the crowd in this film.
Yes.
And you think about Joaquin Phoenix in Gladiator, and he's got a secondary role. But he doesn't do much at points. But what you get from his grumpiness and his scowling and all that is so rich, and you feel everything's going on. And here Napoleon, in some ways, is played in fairly similar, kind of similarly, and you don't feel any as you were saying, Jose, the sense of who he is and what his character is and what he's thinking, you don't get in this.
But it brings me. One thing I wanted to pick up is something I think, Jose, you said very early on about the film, the way that Napoleon moves through time, the way it kind of like progresses and cuts in between, like whole years disappear in between things, which I felt was a real issue for me, that it didn't make enough meaning and purpose behind how and where it was cutting, and you were losing time. I think even something like Gladiator, where you have when God, whatever his name is, either the character or the actor, I've forgotten everything.
Maximus Decimus
in Gladiator.
Meridius?
That's the one. Let's stick with Maximus. When he's kind of when he's remembering his past, and you get those kind of visions of his kind of hand going through the corn, and that the cutting is so precise and it's so limited, you get a very clear sense of past and present and what it means. There's a kind of reflection on what is lost in the past and what he's trying to kind of get, and all the rest of it. In Napoleon, there's no reflection on the passing of time.
Yes.
And that is something that so many of the other Napoleon films, I think especially the Gance film, does so pertinently, is reflect on it, the passing of time on screen. And when it kind of moves through time, it's so, other versions are kind of so more precise in what they are trying to do by moving through time in the way they do.
A cliche in Napoleon films, which is often used as a moment for that, is the exile in Elba, right? Which I was expecting a moment of reflection, of sadness, of looking at the past and how did I get here? But there was none of that. I mean, I didn't get that in that scene. That was with the young girls. Yeah, kind of.
That was St. Helena.
Oh, that was St. Helena.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah,
but yes.
No, sorry, go on.
No, I mean, both. But I mean, again, his first exile on Elba, it's like blink of an eye, like 4 or 5 shots. Again, no sense of context or how any of that worked. And similarly with St. Helena, I wanted more time there. Again, that's very. I mean, Monsieur N, the Antoine de Conte film, is entirely set on Helena and shot on Helena, which is very rare. And it's not a particularly good film, but the first shots where Napoleon lands and these huge waves are just like bursting up the cliffs behind them as he's shaking hands with the governor, and it's like, what, this is why you go to location to shoot that. It's a amazing shot. And the only other film which does it was, so Gance wrote a screenplay. It was the 6th film set on St. Helena, which is an astonishing screenplay. Like, he described it as a Titanic bourgeois melodrama. So it's kind of like this great figure brooding on kind of the loss of empires, and then it ends with his death, and there's these kind of visionary passages of kind of waves like climbing up the cliffs in slow motion, and hallucinations and visions and all the rest of it. St. Helena is a fantastic place for someone to reflect on the past, and again, it was virtually nothing in the Scott film, and surely that is the moment when you can look back on things. And if you've not had time to reflect on the way, as this film has not, give it an extra 5 minutes there and do something. Give us some sense of what does the character think of himself? I don't know what the film thinks of him. What does the character think of himself? But even I didn't get even that.
He seems to accept something about himself at that point, because he tries to claim that he's the one who burned down Moscow, and the young girl says it's common knowledge that you didn't, that they did it to themselves. So he's trying to. He wishes he would like to sell this idea of himself, even to these 2 young girls, as this man, this figure, and he wasn't.
So building a legend is but that's not a reflection. Well, I suppose it can be a little bit of a reflection on the past.
No, but it gives you
really
some sense of character, though. Yeah. I mean, the thing about Elba, which is so disappointing, is it just, in a blink of an eye, he writes, "It's been 300 days I've been here, I want to come home." And you're like, why couldn't I see him for 10 seconds being furious or upset or longing or calculating? He just he looked a bit grumpy and pissed off, and then he's off on a boat again.
Yes. So when the lines about with the children in the Scott film, that is a scene in Gance's screenplay, because it's a scene in the book, that girl on screen who was Betsy Balcom, who Napoleon stayed with her family whilst his lodge was being built on St. Helena. He stayed with that family for a few months, and he did interact with her, and she wrote a lovely book about him, saying, he was such an interesting kind of man. But again, it makes nothing of the fact that Napoleon's son he never sees his son again.
Yes.
And in all of the other films, that is not only just mentioned but made something of. The point of Napoleon's playing with these children is his real child is thousands of miles away, and he will never see him again in his life.
So,
especially as this film has made so much of the idea that he needs an heir, he wants an heir, and he finally has one, and then it's almost immediately forgotten.
Yes, and it's. I mean, there's the Gance screenplay was readapted by Lupu Pick for a German film, which is called Napoleon and St. Helena, which is, again, it is nothing like the Gance screenplay. It's a very ordinary film, but it has a lovely moment when Napoleon is kind of setting up in his house, and a box arrives, and he unpacks the box, and it's a bust of his son, and he picks it up out of the crate, and he's so happy, and then he's so desperately sad, and he's kind of holding this bust in his hands, and there's just this close-up of his face, and there's so much weight of meaning, because all he has left of his son is this dead kind of lump of marble, and it's like there's so much longing in it. It's the best scene of the film, and I wanted even just a hint of that, even if it was, with the two girls, just some sense of the sense of generations, and again, like kind of the passing of time and where his legacy is.
It almost wants to make it look like he has no legacy in that scene, like to choose to round off the film with this thing about him wanting to be remembered a certain way and being disabused of that notion. No one's going to remember you like that. To choose that to be the way it signs off, and then he just dies is. And then you're going, but this is 200 years ago, and you're making a film about him now. A little respect,
Well, okay.
He's still important. He has a legacy. Why are you making a film about him otherwise?
So we've trashed the film for about an hour. So are there any redeeming values to it? So again, I thought that it was. Well, I agree with you, Paul. But nonetheless, I want to get at what made it so entertaining. Yeah, why was Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing maybe to end on, really, because it lacks complexity. Some of the scenes feel a bit kind of they lack finesse. But nonetheless, what is it about this film that meant that neither you nor I looked at our watch for 2 hours and 40 minutes. That is an accomplishment, I think. Because in so many much shorter films, you're looking even as you're being entertained. So, any positive thoughts about this film?
Was it just the hats?
It was. I mean, again, it's all perfectly competent. I mean, it's perfectly competent from beginning to end, and I think perhaps also the fact that it never reflects upon itself really at all sort of keeps you going through it, because it never asks you to look at what's going on too carefully, because perhaps if you did, you would be more disappointed. You'll be more distracted by what's going on at this moment. I was thinking, I know, Jose, recently you were reading a lot of Stefan Zweig novels. May I please recommend his almost exact contemporary, but in my view, superior writer, Josef Roth, R-O-T-H.
Okay.
And Radetzky March is his most famous book, but he did actually write a book about Napoleon. And it's not one of his best ones, but the way it is divided up, and Roth is an extraordinary writer. He keeps you going, but keeps doing astonishing things, like in a sentence. The way the whole thing will suddenly turn just in a sentence is astonishing. And his Napoleon book, his chapters are often just one paragraph. And mid-scene, the scene will be like kind of 10 chapters. And the fact that he breaks it up into paragraphs is so significant, because like something falls to the floor and Napoleon looks at it, end of chapter, next chapter. It's like you would have to do that in a film with like a dissolve or a break or something. And this film never had that, which was both an advantage, and then it kept moving, but also a disadvantage, and then it kind of denied itself any chance to make how it was going forward through time meaningful. It kept like all its balls juggling in the air, which is fine, but it wasn't do anything. There was no payoff to the trick, as it were. Even an accident would have been interesting, but the fact there were no accidents at any point, fine. You get to the end of the film and you've not looked at your watch, but that is in itself a kind of problem. I almost sort of wanted like some ruptures, some breaks somewhere to think, okay, well, this is an interesting rupture.
Okay.
It's too the smoothness, just the kind of the endless steady pace was it's the reason I didn't look at my watch, but it was also one of my real problems with the film.
Okay.
I don't know if I've articulated that coherently.
No, you have. Mike, do you have any?
Yeah, well, as I suggested, there are a few scenes that the film comes alive for me, which particularly a couple of those battle scenes. And I think this is really properly economical filmmaking, in the way that it's building tension and giving me kind of all the information that I need just at the right moment to say, here's the army that may be coming, here's how we're hiding, and so on and so forth. That stuff really worked for me, and it put it in contrast with everything else the film was doing, which I suppose you could also say is economical, but I kind of would more refer to it as shorthand. It's that, like I say, that stuff with Egypt, the stuff with the relationship. Like, I think the thing with the relationship is you just get these shots of Josephine with this sort of low cut dresses that she's wearing, and you go, wow, she's got a fantastic pair of tits, and you go like, that seems to be the way the film is condensing the attraction. I think maybe that's just my personal prejudice about Vanessa Kirby's tits, but I think she's
that
kind
was
of
the fashion of the day.
I think she's kind of shown off in that way. And the thing with Egypt, it's done in shorthand. He's shot at the pyramids, and we just know that he took Egypt and so on. So it worked for me at times, and it didn't work for me at other times. But as I said to you, I did check my watch, and I did find myself bored, and I kind of was thinking, where is the dramatist? Where are we ultimately going? And when you move from, the film is constantly bringing up titles of 1799, 1812. Here we are. This is the Battle of so and so. This is the conference with so and so. And you're like, what led us here? And where are we going next? The kind of, I don't want to say it felt like reading a Wikipedia page. I think that's too dismissive. But it felt like, here's just the list of things that happened in his life. Let's move through them. Didn't feel motivated. So that's my ultimate answer. Like, there are points that works, but most of the time I wanted much more.
We're going to give you the last word, Paul.
Oh dear! I have too many words, and I have no words. Do
you think it will last? Do you think it will linger? Do you think people will remember this?
No, I don't think so. I'm very depressed about everything that I've read about the film, both for good and bad. I think all of the criticisms that it's generated is so missing, like, the main points, either for pros or cons about the film, and it just sort of, it's such a kind of depressing swirl of kind of nothingness around the film, which itself is not worth any of the fuss of the criticism of historians or anyone. I mean, it doesn't have enough to make you have a strong opinion about it, which is
Well, if you want to have a strong opinion, then by all means see Abel Gance's Napoleon and read Paul's wonderful book on it called The Revolution for the Screen, Abel Gance's Napoleon. So thank you very much for joining us, Paul.
Well, thank you very much for letting me be here.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you. I learned an awful lot.
We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at Eavesdrop Movies, and Blue Sky, eavesdropping.bsky.social, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul.